are going to be co-presenting today about the exhibit we mentioned earlier that's downstairs called Toward a Universal Suffrage, African American Women in Iowa and the Vote for All. So the exhibit was organized by the Department of Human Rights, the department I work for, the Central Iowa Community Museum, and also the Catt Center for Women in Politics. So really the idea for the project originated several years ago after I had had several conversations with colleagues, professors, historians, when planning for 2020. Because honestly, all of the stories I've ever read, I grew up in Iowa, were about basically just focused on white women's suffrage. And I was having a difficult time finding anything on women who were not white. And was getting just really frustrated, like, I know the history of suffrage, like I know the roots, and if you know the history, it really came out of the anti-slavery movement. And so out of curiosity, I just started reaching out to a lot of the state universities, met with some historians, and finally got to the University of Iowa with the Women and Gender Studies program, and talked to a professor there whose research had really focused on African American women in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so after a lengthy conversation with her, she mentioned kind of where to go to look for things. And so she had actually told me the Library of Congress had a Chronicling America series where I could find primary source documents for the Iowa Bystander, which is one of the longest running African American newspapers in the US, I believe. And then archived copies of the NAACP papers. And so kind of starting that research, I very quickly realized I was going to need some help. And so Alan Minkowicz, who is sitting right in the front here, from Drake University, through a writing program that they had, I was able to hire Alan to do some research for me. So thanks, Alan. And we approached the State Historical Society, the Iowa Women's Archives, and also the African American Museum of Iowa to see really if they would be interested in taking the project on, if they'd be interested in consulting for the project, and also just to look for funding for it, because that's always an issue. And then came Eric. So I'm going to let Eric take it from there.
So Kristen mentioned the State Historical Society. I know the director of the State Historical Society, Susan Clover, and I had met with her about the Central Iowa Community Museum, the idea I had for that museum, which I'll talk about in a second. For a number of reasons, the State Historical Society couldn't take on this project of doing this exhibition, but Susan very quickly connected me to Kristen, and Kristen and I met for coffee and tea one morning, and that was about a year ago, and we've been working on this ever since. I do want to mention that the State Historical Society is very supportive of this project. We're going to show you the schedule of how this exhibition is going to travel. It is going to be at the State Historical Museum in Des Moines in the months of June and July. And then the State Historical Society is partnering with the Secretary of State's office. There's going to be a big celebration at the State Capitol building on Saturday, August 22nd, and the exhibition is going to be part of that celebration. As well, on the same day is the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame induction, which is part of the Iowa Department of Human Rights, so the exhibition will be at both places. I do want to talk briefly about the Central Iowa Community Museum. This is a new museum I'm creating. This is the first exhibition that's part of that museum. The idea behind the museum is to tell the stories of all the diversity of life that is within Central Iowa, and that's not just racial and ethnic diversity. It could be any type of identity, sexual identity. We could do an exhibition about homelessness. We want to do issue-based exhibitions as well. Exhibitions about foster children, things like that. So it's really exhibitions that, it's not art, it's not necessarily history. It may draw from those things, but it's about our neighbors within our community and understanding them and understanding the issues that are important to them and then advocating on those issues as well. I want to thank Alan, who's here. I want to thank Kristen, who worked on this project with us, and then the other person that organized it is Dr. Karen Krudowski from the Catt Center. And then we also want to give a special shout out to Kyo Piran, who is a graphic designer here at ISU. And if you've seen the exhibition, it's just visually stunning to look at, and that's thanks to Kyo's hard work and his talent. We also want to thank our funders for the exhibition. So the Iowa State University College of Liberal Arts and Sciences is a major funder for this, as well as Humanities Iowa, which has provided a grant to us. The Chrysalis Foundation in Des Moines has also provided us a grant, and then the Hard One Not Done Centennial Committee has given us a lot of support as well. So the Community Museum doesn't have a permanent location yet. What I'm trying to do is create a series of pop-up exhibitions like this to build awareness and support for the idea before we would move into a permanent location. The intent of this exhibition is that it's going to travel throughout the state of Iowa, and what you're seeing on the screen now is some locations that we have secured already. So I hope if you've enjoyed seeing the exhibition that you'll tell your friends, your family members to maybe look at it at one of these locations. We have a schedule printed on the Community Museum's website. We'll put that information up at the end. And then if you're interested in hosting this, or if you know of an organization that might be interested in hosting it, we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation.
Are you speaking of the exhibition that's downstairs?
Yes, I am, sir. Yep.
Just that was off to the side of the outside?
Correct. Yep.
And you're going to expand that and find a permanent position?
What we want to do is some different exhibitions around different issues. So I would really like to get another exhibition mounted this year since it's an election year. I would really like to do an exhibition about immigration in some facet. I think that would be a fascinating exhibition to do. Immigration is one of those perennial topics. It always seems to get more attention during an election year. And I think doing some type of exhibition about immigration will help us all better understand the story of people who are immigrating to this country now, so that we can, get past this idea of building a wall and get to the idea of those folks who are coming to this country receiving a warm embrace from us instead.
I'm a volunteer to do something down with the little food trucks, and then I would surely like to get involved with you sometime.
Great, so we'll get connected at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, and if we could hold our questions for the end, or if you have ideas, if you could write them down, just because I know we're coming up on time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll hand this back to you.
Sure. So to start off with, we are going to move to the next slide and talk about the women we focused on in this exhibit. So one of the things that I would like to mention too is the reason we chose the women we focused on were really, these were women that we could find a lot of information on in the state of Iowa. And if there are any budding historians in this room or anyone else, there's so much research left to be done. So our goal is to keep going. So the first suffragist we chose to focus on today is Gertrude Rush. So Ms. Rush was involved in many organizations dedicated to African American women's rights and women's rights in general. She served as the president of the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs from 1911 to 1915. She was a member of the Colored Women's Suffrage Club and believed that African Americans' women's right to vote was an opportunity for equity and equality. She saw it as an opportunity to end racial discrimination and injustice. She was also the first African American woman in the state of Iowa to pass the Iowa bar exam. She passed in 1918 after studying law but was denied admittance to the American Bar Association in 1924. So in response to that practice of denying admission to African Americans, she, the only female, along with other African American men, founded what is now known as the National Bar Association. And I don't know if any of you are from the Des Moines area or have been down to Des Moines, kind of by 2nd Avenue. There is a sculpture right by the Women of Achievement Bridge called A Monumental History that was dedicated to the work of Gertrude Rush and the men who founded that. She remained the only African American woman to practice law in the state of Iowa until the 1950s. So the second suffragist we chose to focus on was Sue M. Wilson Brown. Miss Wilson Brown was known as an organizer and a doer. She mobilized people at the local, state, and national levels to improve the political, economic, and social status of African Americans in the state of Iowa, but also nationally. She established and participated in many women's clubs to advocate for change. She founded the Des Moines Mary Church Terrell Club, named for a nationally known African American suffragist and also a civil rights advocate. She and her husband, S. Joe Brown, established the Des Moines chapter of the NAACP, and she became the first female president of that chapter in 1925. She is also well known for being one of the main advocates to advocate for and get housing for the African American female students at the University of Iowa who were unable to live in the dorms at the time due to discrimination. Among the million other things that she did, she was also an author and wrote several books, including The History of the Order of the Eastern Star Among Colored People, of which she was an incredibly active member throughout her life. So I could go on and on about the work of these two women. I encourage you to go out and look and research more on your own, but now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Another suffragist we highlight is Helena Downey. Mrs. Downey was the first president of the Iowa branch of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, later known as the Iowa Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. This club was founded under her leadership in 1902 at a convention in Ottumwa, and by the next year there were 8 other clubs in the state of Iowa that had more than 100 members. These women's clubs that African American women founded, they didn't work just on suffrage, they did work on suffrage, but they worked on many other things, including health, education, social service, and civics. Mrs. Downey was also speaker at many club events, and one of her speeches, Our Girls, may have been her take on suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton's speech of the same name. Vivian B. Smith is known as one of the Buxton women, and we'll talk about Buxton here in a second, who were public advocates for women's suffrage during the early 1900s. She believed that women's right to vote would be beneficial not only to African Americans, but whites as well. She was also a member of the Waterloo Suffragette Council and served as chair of a suffrage committee for the Iowa State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs in 1917. She attended the Iowa State Teachers College at Cedar Falls. We all know that as the University of Northern Iowa now. And she was the only student of color at the time, and she graduated in 1916. She became a teacher and taught in Iowa, in Blairsburg, and Cameron, and she also moved to Illinois and taught there.
So next we'd like to highlight a few significant events in African American women's suffrage history in Iowa, and then also focus on the legacy, so kind of where we stand today and some of our current or more current leaders. So in May of 1902, the Iowa Association of Colored Women's Clubs, later known as the Iowa Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, was founded, as Eric mentioned, with Helena, as she was also known, Downey of Ottumwa was the first president. So in 1914, the club formed a standing suffrage committee, which was headed by Teresa Adams of Davenport. And this is a picture of the meeting of the club in Davenport in May 1903. So the town of Buxton, Iowa was a coal mining company, coal mining town named after Ben Buxton, the president of the Consolidation Coal Company. So it was located in Monroe County, and Buxton no longer exists. Beginning in the 1890s, the town attracted a large African-American population to work in coal mines. And then during the 19th and early 20th centuries, many African-Americans migrated to northern states to find employment and economic conditions, better economic conditions. It was known for being a multi-ethnic community with no legal segregation. It was also played an important role in African-Americans' women's suffrage movement. So for example, the parents of suffrage leader Sue Ann Wilson Brown moved to Buxton from Virginia. And then also in June of 1916, a family parade was held, and the women, men, and children who marched in that parade supported women's suffrage.
So in 1919, the 19th Amendment passes the U.S. House of Representatives in May. It passes the U.S. Senate about 2 or 3 weeks later, and then at that point it moves to the states to be ratified. Iowa moves pretty quickly to ratify the amendment, just a little bit under a month after it passes the Senate. There's a special session of the legislature that's called, and on the same day, both the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate ratify the 19th Amendment. So Iowa moves pretty quickly. It becomes the 10th state to ratify the amendment, and it does so just 2 days before the celebration of Independence Day. Iowa's African American women moved pretty quickly as well. So here you again see Sue Ann Wilson Brown. The Des Moines League of Colored Women Voters was organized in August of 1919. Sue Ann Wilson Brown was its founder and first president. Leagues were also formed in Keokuk and Fort Dodge. And members of the league volunteered in various capacities at the polls for an election in Des Moines in 1920. On October 2nd, the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association reorganized as the Iowa League of Women Voters. This happened in Boone. The organization was later renamed the League of Women Voters of Iowa. And again, Sue Ann Wilson Brown was involved. She was the president of the Des Moines League of Colored Women Voters. And she spoke at the last convention of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association. And she and 3 other members of the Des Moines League of Colored Women Voters were delegates to the first convention of the Iowa League of Women Voters. So in 1920, Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and then it becomes part of the Constitution. In 1924, Sue Ann Wilson Brown, she was a tremendous organizer and activist, was involved again. She became the first vice president of the National League of Republican Colored Women and was the chair of the Polk County Republican Committee. Here in Iowa, members of this club were unique because they used the telephone in a get-out-to-vote effort. The National League of Republican Colored Women was organized by Sue Ann Wilson Brown and other members of the National Association of Colored Women. And I wanted to bring this up because it's always interesting to look at things that happened in history and how people did things at a certain historical moment and compare that to our own time. There were a number of women who thought that the National Association of Colored Women had become too partisan in their support of Republican candidates. And so they formed this other organization to try and get the National League of Colored Women to be more of a non-partisan organization. And we live in a very partisan time, and I think that was very admirable of them to do that. And I just kind of wonder to myself if other people if other organizations would reflect on that today.